Okay, I think we're at a good point now. So just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. My name's Jim Mooney. I'm the program manager for the Resilient Communities program and the Ivy Hill Stormwater Mitigation program. Um, and this is the first mandatory training that we're doing on topic of procurement and contracting. We do plan to have additional trainings like this on different topics like environmental reviews and other specific topics that we need to cover. But this is the first of our uh, required training sessions. So we will ask that everyone remain on mute until the end of the presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. If you do want to enter any questions in the chat while we're going through the presentation, that's fine. We'll have someone monitoring that and we'll get to the questions. But if not, at the end, we'll, open it up. You can come off mute and ask any specific questions if you have them. We are recording this session, by the way, so we can post it on our website along with the slides. So if anybody wants to, review them after, or if maybe someone from your team couldn't make it today, they'll be available for you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dana from our consultant ICF, who's going to walk us through the presentation today.
Great, thank
Thank
you,
you, Dana.
Jim. Hi, everyone. My name is Dana Ruback. As Jim said, I'm with ICF. We are contracted with DCA to help support the Resilient Communities program, as well as a variety of other programs within their CDBG-DR program portfolio. I have probably about 10 or so years of experience with the CDBG-DR program and doing federal procurement and federal procurement review. So looking forward to going through the requirements and some kind of guidelines and best practices for y'all today to make sure that everyone's feeling comfortable with the procurement and contracting requirements under this grant. So briefly, our agenda, we're going to go through your requirements, the different methods of procurement, what is required as far as cost and price analyses. You'll see different types of procurements, and then we will get into some contracting issues such as change orders and modifications, what you can do both pre and post award in your procurements, different record keeping and documentation requirements, and then your contracting requirements. The goal today is not necessarily to make everyone a procurement expert, right? But we do want you all to understand and feel comfortable and know that the CDBG-DR grant does come with federal procurement requirements that are dictated under 2 CFR 200. After this presentation, you should generally be familiar with the different types of procurements, as well as a high level of what the requirements are under the federal guidelines. But then, there will be follow-up. You have a procurement chapter of your subrecipient manual. We will encourage you kind of a couple of times in this presentation to refer back directly to the requirements in 2 CFR 200. So this is kind of a kickoff for you to start your understanding if you don't already have kind of a base knowledge of the federal procurement requirements. So all subrecipients of CDBG-DR funds are required to follow the uniform administrative requirements under 2 CFR Part 200. So those are the guiding regulations that cover all of the procurement requirements that we will go over today. This is also detailed in the subrecipient manual, related chapters to procurement and contracting that I believe most of you have received the procurement chapter on this. We will talk a little bit about how these federal rules and requirements then are connected with your local procurement codes and any relevant executive orders that might dictate how you have to use your federal funds. So I've referred to the subrecipient manual. I think I'm aware that in your conversations with Jim and his team, you've been made aware of the subrecipient manual, the chapter on procurement that's coming out. So as subrecipients of CDBG-DR infrastructure funding, this subrecipient manual details the policies and requirements that you must adhere to, and provide additional information and resources. So this manual should be your first point of reference. And obviously today we will go through what is in the procurement and some of the contracting chapters, but that is really your guide to go back to after we finish with this presentation today. So, I've referred to 2 CFR Part 200 and the procurement requirements that are housed within that set of regulations. This is just a little bit more detail on where you can find these and which sections we're specifically speaking of. So subrecipients are required to comply with the requirements under 2 CFR 200, 318 through 327. 327 being specific contract provisions that must be included. And so when everyone gets a copy of these slides, this right here will give you a link to this section of the CFR. And we really encourage everyone to go and read it yourselves. We're giving you guidance here, but it is important that you see what the requirements are as stated in the CFR. So when you get a federal grant, right, we know that there is some interplay between your federal or your local requirements and the federal requirements. And when it comes to procurement, you should always be following the most restrictive procurement requirements. So you can't just maybe toss out your local procurement code if your local procurement code is more restrictive than the federal requirements. So for example, maybe a threshold for when you need to put something out to bid is lower for your local procurement than it is in the federal requirements. You still need to follow your local procurement code in that instance. So as you're getting into the CDBG-DR program, you may have to do somewhat of a crosswalk between what is here, what we're presenting today on the federal requirements and what your local code dictates, just to make sure that you are always following what is the most restrictive requirement. When we're talking about federal procurement and federal or costs that will be reimbursed with federal dollars, one of the tools we like to use is this acronym RADAR, that all procurements should be reasonable, allowable, documented, and allocable. And so what does this mean really, right? And some of these are a little bit subjective in how they are described in the CFR. So when we say that all costs must be necessary and reasonable, they must be necessary to carrying out the activities within your grant, and they must be reasonable to what a prudent person would, spend on similar costs. So we do this through a variety of means, proving this cost reasonableness, and we'll get to that in a couple of the future slides. Allowable costs under the grant. So you should be familiar with, allowable eligible activities for CDBG-DR funding that were reviewed probably during the application phase and all, but all of your costs must be allowable under this grant. Documentation is super important, particularly with procurement. All of your procurement files really should be telling a story from the beginning on how you decided, what method of procurement you need, how the solicitation process went, how the selection process went, and then all the way through to your contracting and invoicing. And they must be appropriately allocated to the correct funding source. So what does this mean? This is if you maybe are leveraging CDBG-DR funds with some local funding or some other federal funding such as FEMA, you need to have really good cost controls in place to ensure that you are tracking the CDBG-DR funding specifically, and that costs are being allocated appropriately to that grant. And if you follow all of these steps, if they're reasonable, allowable, documented, and allocated, then you'll be eligible for reimbursement for those costs. One of the things we talk about a lot in federal procurement is fair and open competition. So the goal of all of or most of the requirements under 2 CFR 200 is to support and make sure that there's fair and open competition, that people have equal opportunity and access to participate in federally funded contracts. So we're looking at ways that we may remove impediments to fair and open competition. And so to do this, we would provide an opportunity for all eligible and interested businesses to respond to a procurement, making sure that, it is publicly advertised and available to all bidders who may be responsible and fit the requirements of the solicitation. That equal information is made available to all interested bidders. So any questions that are answered, Q&A, any information that is being provided needs to be made available to all interested bidders. That you're not requiring any unnecessary experience or excessive bonding. There are bonding requirements that are associated with federal funding, but going above and beyond that, or putting into place requirements that don't really maybe serve the purpose of the contract, or anything that might lead you unnecessarily to a specific vendor would be something that we'd consider limiting fair and open competition. Do not offer non-competitive contracts to current contractors. We'll talk about this in some of the future slides, but non-competitive or sole source procurements are very, very limited with federal funding. Don't specify a brand name of a product if it's not absolutely necessary. This would only be if, maybe there is one specific type of, software that does a particular thing where you really need that brand. Maybe you could do that. But as much as possible, you wouldn't want to specify a specific brand name. Geographical preference is generally not allowed under federal procurements. And then you also want to make sure that you are not allowing contractors who have helped to develop or draft specifications or scope or any of the qualifications that might be included in your bid to then bid on that project, because they would have an unfair advantage in participating in that solicitation. Conflict of interest is an important thing to consider, and make sure that you have written conflict of interest policies in place, particularly when it relates to procurement. Most, municipalities, local governments, and all do have a written conflict of interest policy when it comes to procurement. So these are just some of the required kind of standards for what conflict of interest policies and all should cover when it's related to federal procurements. So to make sure that, again, that it's written and documented, there's a focus on, no involvement in contracts by those with real or apparent conflicts. And so obviously we know that apparent conflict, whether it is true, is something that can put into jeopardy your procurements potentially if there is an appearance of conflict of interest. And, there should be, a prohibition on gratuities, disciplinary actions. I won't read through this whole slide. I think in general, folks understand, though, that this is important and should be built into your process of your procurement process, and making sure that there are steps where your potential contractors and all understand what your conflict of interest policy is, and that they have to adhere to it as well. So at a very high level, this is an overview of how you will likely be setting up your procurement processes. So first step, of course, is to adopt a compliant procurement policy. The chapter of your subrecipient manual should really be this, compliant procurement policy that you're using. That would, like I said, kind of go hand in hand with whatever your local procurement code states, and again, you're always following the most restrictive requirement there. Defining internal controls. So this is, of course, controls that will guard against fraud, waste, and abuse. This is a high priority for federal funding as well, to make sure that there are safeguards in place. Often this entails assigning functions in such a way where there are checks and balances in your procurement process. You want to make sure that those are well documented. Defining your scope of work is really important, to have a clear vision and stated, narrative and description of what your scope of work is. For whatever type of procurement you're doing, this is really important and should be a focus up front, to make sure that you're getting the best possible proposals, the best most accurate pricing. You want to avoid as much as possible future change orders or modifications to your contract, and really well defining your scope of work up front. Doing that legwork up front is going to help avoid those issues potentially later on. And then once you have your scope of work, that's what's going to help you identify the type of procurement that you're doing, whether it's a sealed bid, an RFP, or maybe it's a small purchase type procurement. You want to establish a cost estimate. We'll go into a little bit more detail on this, but again, because all of your costs under a federal grant need to be reasonable, there are tools that we use, including cost estimates, both to help you budget, right? It's a very practical thing to do, have a cost estimate, but it is also a requirement for federal funds, so that you're demonstrating that your ultimate contract is in line with what your initial cost estimate was in order to demonstrate cost reasonableness. You then publish your solicitation. In your solicitation, it should have information about how it will be evaluated, what your scoring criteria or process for evaluation is, and then you document your decision. And every procurement file should have a really clear trail of documentation showing how the decision was made. So I've mentioned cost reasonableness, cost or price analyses. These are the kind of two tools that you will use in evaluating price or cost of a contract. They're similar but different. A price analysis is typically what you would use, particularly for either a small purchase or maybe a sealed bid where you're just getting one lump sum, and you're looking at just the total price. So what is my total price of this procurement? And you're looking at that maybe against research that you've done previously, or past purchases or whatever, to see if this is a good price. A cost analysis would be a breakout. So if you're looking at kind of a full budget of a proposed project or a proposed contract, and evaluating the different cost components and evaluating each to make sure that those are reasonable and that they're all related to and required for your project, for the contract, and that there aren't any unnecessary costs that have been included. An independent cost estimate is required for every procurement action above the simplified acquisition threshold. And the simplified acquisition threshold, I think that I give the definition later.
One clear.
I'm sorry, did somebody have a question on this? Okay. The simplified acquisition threshold is a threshold for procurements that's set in the CFR. Right now it is $250,000. So anything above that, you must, and this is required, and HUD or the OIG or anyone who's looking at procurement files, if you have a large contract, they're going to look and check to make sure that you have documentation that you performed an independent cost estimate prior to your solicitation. These can be done by your internal staff, so qualified staff who understands, the project that's being solicited, what is required of it. Could be done by third-party consultants. You might bring someone in, an engineer, whoever, to perform an independent cost estimate as well. But it's important to know that it should be prepared prior your solicitation. And again, cost or price analyses, and as we go through each method of procurement, we'll talk about what's the most relevant, is required once you get the responses to make sure that they are in line with what your expectation was. So once you get your bids or your proposals, you do a cost or price analysis, and what you would have to then think about while you're doing this is if all of the bids that have come in are way above what you would typically see, you really need to dig deeper into, why that is. Are there, external conditions that have changed the price of things recently? Or, is it a market, is something going on in the market? And you would need to document why either you're accepting what this price is based on your cost analysis, or you might consider if your cost or price analysis results in you saying, actually, these are all really unreasonable, there's always a chance where you might go back and resolicit, that none of these met the requirements that you were looking for. So we'll look at the methods of procurement. There are 5 basic methods of procurement. And we'll go through each of these and the thresholds and the different requirements under the federal regulations. So micro purchases are, for federal funding, are purchases of typically supplies that are equal to or less than $10,000. This can be done without competitive price or rate quotations. So if you have a purchase that is going to be under $10,000, it still needs to be reasonable. You would still need to document that you're paying a reasonable price for it, but you don't need to go out and solicit several price quotations or whatever. Again, if your local procurement code has a threshold that is lower than $10,000, you should be following that threshold. Additionally, while this $10,000 threshold is set for micro purchases, you typically would not use this method for construction or professional services, even if they fall under this, because it's very difficult to then justify cost reasonableness and make sure that you're getting really qualified vendors here. So again, this is typically used for the acquisition of supplies or kind of simple purchases. Small purchases are refer to the acquisition of property or services when the aggregate dollar amount is greater than the micro purchase threshold, which is $10,000, but does not exceed the simplified acquisition threshold, which is $250,000. Occasionally, these thresholds do get updated by the federal government. So these are the current thresholds for micro purchase and the simplified acquisition threshold, but it's a good idea probably on an annual basis to check these. And of course, if these get updated, DCA will also update their requirements and will alert subrecipients to this change as well. But it's good just for you to be aware that sometimes these thresholds do get updated by the federal government. When you're doing a small purchase within this range, you are required to obtain price or rate quotes from what the federal government says an adequate number of qualified sources. We typically like to see at least 3 quotes to be able to, choose and justify cost reasonableness. So our rule of thumb here is 3 quotes for being an adequate number of qualified resources. But you may have to determine what is right in your different, small purchase scenarios. Again, it's recommended that any professional services, including those under the simplified acquisition threshold, are still procured competitively, like through an RFP process, in order to ensure that you're getting a really highly qualified provider that is also, cost reasonable, because through that process, you'll be able to evaluate them and their experience and their qualifications more so than you would if you're just soliciting price quotes. So this is just a quick summary of what under the under 2 CFR 200 calls informal procurement. So those are the micro purchases and the small purchases. You should be doing cost analyses for these. Here you'll see the dollar threshold. I didn't mention this earlier, but $2,000 for construction for micro purchases. We typically see that because that's when Davis-Bacon is triggered. And so if you have a Davis-Bacon triggered project, and most, if not all, of your infrastructure projects will trigger Davis-Bacon, you don't want to be doing micro, and you likely won't ever see a construction contract for under $2,000, but wanted to flag this here that micro purchases are generally inappropriate for construction contracts. Okay, we're going to pause here for a quick knowledge check, and I'm going to read through this, and then I would like to encourage some participation here. And so once we read through the scenario and I give you the choices, I'd like folks to feel free to either put in the chat or come off mute briefly and let me know what you think the response is. And I'll kind of wait until maybe I hear at least one response and then we can go over this. Don't be shy. Obviously, we've just gone through this for the first time. So please, go through it and then we can talk through what the response is. So in this scenario, you want to use your CDBG-DR grant funding to pay for a grant administration consultant who will support admin activities. You do a cost estimate, and your estimate for these services results, and you think the contract will be around $75,000. This falls under the simplified acquisition threshold. However, your local procurement policy requires all purchases over $50,000 to go out for a competitive RFP process. So what procurement process will you use to solicit these services? A, this is a small purchase under the federal regulations. So you will solicit a sufficient number of quotes and to select a contractor without putting out a formal RFP. Or B, you will follow the most restrictive procurement policy, which is your local policy, and put the solicitation out as an RFP. And Chris, if anyone puts their answer in the chat, feel free to come off mute and let me know too, but I'd like folks to give this a little thought.
I would go for A, B.
I heard A and B.
No, not A, B,
great.
B.
Oh, B. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Seeing some B's in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Y'all have been paying attention. Thank you. So yes, you're right. In this instance, even though it is under the simplified acquisition threshold, you still need to follow your local procurement policy, as that's the most restrictive, and put this out as a competitive RFP process. So now we're going to look at formal procurements, which are your sealed bids, your RFPs, your RFQs. So typically these are required for all of your contracts that are above the simplified acquisition threshold, but you also may be using these methods for contracts that are under this amount if it is the most appropriate procurement type, for instance, for a construction contract or an engineering or professional services contract. Just to give a little bit more detail, I don't think this is new information to anyone. These aren't unique definitions to the federal procurement requirements, but sealed bids, are publicly solicited and they result in a firm fixed price contract, so a lump sum or unit price contract, and is awarded to the lowest responsible bidder. An RFP, again, publicly solicited and could either result in a fixed price or cost reimbursement type contract. These proposals are solicited from an adequate number of qualified offerers. You must complete an independent cost estimate for these ahead of your review of bids. And so, as it says here, subrecipients must follow a written method for conducting technical evaluations of the proposals received. So for your request for proposals, you will be evaluating a variety of criteria, including experience, their proposed, work plan potentially, and cost. Your request for qualifications, this is typically set aside only for architectural and engineering contracts, where you're evaluating an offerer's qualifications and you select the most qualified offerer, and then you negotiate a fair and reasonable compensation. So in this one, you're not evaluating price up front, but contracts still need to be cost reasonable. And again, I'll just reiterate that these are really only utilized under 2 CFR 200 for architectural and engineering services. This is not an appropriate mechanism for other types of contracts. For all other types of contracts, you should be evaluating price or cost as part of the solicitation process. And I know it's called out kind of specifically for RFPs, but independent cost estimates are required for all of these types of formal procurements. So your sealed bid, in order for sealed bidding to be feasible, the following conditions should be present. So you need a complete, adequate, and realistic specification or purchase description. So this is obviously, you need your scope of work to be robust, to be detailed, to be specific, so that all of your bidders are putting forth a sealed bid based on those specifications, and you're getting those bids are then going to be accurate and entail all of the work that you need to be done. You need a scenario where 2 or more responsible bidders are willing and able to compete effectively for the business. The procurement lends itself to a firm fixed price contract, and the selection of the successful bidder can be made principally on the basis of price. Again, this is where you are going to be selecting the lowest responsible bidder in your sealed bids. And just as a note, this is the process that you will use for CDBG-DR funded construction work. This is the most appropriate process for CDBG-DR funded construction work. So RFPs and RFQs, again, your RFPs are for professional services, which may be grant or program admin, case management, legal services, could also be design services, potentially. If you're soliciting contractors to support for environmental services, this would be, you would do this under an RFP likely. And again, when you're soliciting proposals through an RFP, must include price. You have to evaluate price in this method, their method of implementation, their experience, and their capacity. These are kind of the areas that you'll be evaluating. And just to reiterate, for an RFQ, which again you only really use for architecture and engineering services, where you're making your decision principally on their qualifications, and then you're doing your price negotiation. One thing I will flag as well is that RFQs cannot be used in like a design build style contract. So if you have any type of like non-engineering work within the scope, it is inappropriate to use an RFQ in that solicitation, because you need to be able to evaluate price on those. And so I won't go through all of this, but this is just a good summary of what we just talked about as far as sealed bid versus RFPs, RFQs, where you can find the definitions and the requirements in 2 CFR 200. And again, these are typically used for all procurements over the simplified acquisition threshold, but you may be utilizing these for potentially lower dollar value ones if the services kind of dictate that this would be the most appropriate method of procurement. So I've kind of touched on this in some other slides, but I want to reiterate again that every procurement action must include a detailed scope of work or services. This is just so important to get this right up front. Like I said, it can get tricky when you haven't put the work in up front, or you miss something, and then contract modifications or change orders are required. There's a limitation in CDBG-DR grant funding. And so if actual costs come in much higher than was anticipated, you want to always be looking at your grant budgets. Additionally, if you miss a type, a piece of the scope that requires a specialized skill set or experience level, you might wind up selecting a contractor that maybe doesn't serve you as well as it could be if your scope of work had been, more detailed and more accurate to what was required. And then all solicitations must contain the criteria on which the responses will be scored. And the scope of work should be part of that. So within any of your procurements, particularly RFP, RFQ, you should be listing out your selection criteria, how it's scored, who's scoring, so that, and like the points associated typically with each category, so that all of the proposers, all of the potential vendors know exactly how the selection will be made. This is also, obviously a good practice. You want to have this out there. Reduces the likelihood of folks challenging when they really understand how they will be scored from the onset. All right, we'll do another knowledge check. So again, please feel free once I finish reading to come off mute, and then Chris can let me know too if folks are coming in the chat. So your city has a long-standing contract with a firm that has drafted a project scope, design specs, and some other materials that you are then going to integrate into your city's upcoming request for bids for its CDBG-DR infrastructure project. Is that firm that prepared the project scope and design specs allowed to bid on the upcoming project?
No.
Yes or no? I heard a
No.
no. Great. So just a little, exactly right. Contractors, and this is is a form of limiting fair and open competition. So that is why this is not allowed. Contractors that develop or draft specifications, requirements, etc., must be excluded from competing in those procurements because they have knowledge potentially of the upcoming bid. They have a kind of unfair advantage that they have gained in doing so. Ahead of other bidders, and they may then also have additional time to prepare a response if they know the bid is coming out. So this would give them an unfair advantage, and it's for that reason they are not allowed to bid on those projects. So non-competitive procurements, we'll talk about this briefly, but the big takeaway here is that sole source procurements are extremely restricted using federal funds. So non-competitive or sole source procurements can only be awarded if one or more of the following circumstances apply. And so I'm going to read through these because these are spelled out in 2 CFR 200, and these are the only reasons that anyone can do a sole source procurement. There's not flexibility built into this. So it is either you have to fit into one or more of these 5 categories. So it's the acquisition of property or services, the aggregate dollar amount of which does not exceed the micro purchase threshold we talked about. So it's a micro purchase. The item is available only from a single source. Again, this might be for like a proprietary technology solution that you really need and it's only available from that, or there's only one maybe manufacturer, but for services, for contracting services, for design services, this wouldn't be the case. The public exigency or emergency for the requirement will not permit delay resulting from publicizing competitive solicitation. This can be utilized in emergency scenarios, and we might see this more often for like FEMA funded contracts. But at this point, because we're far enough out from the disaster, you would have to have a really, really, really good justification for using this, or maybe there is a different emergency scenario that that you would have to tie it back to. The federal awarding agency or pass-through entity expressly authorizes it. So the federal awarding agency for CDBG-DR funds is HUD. and that would be in response to a written request. HUD typically is not going to grant this if it doesn't fall into one of the other categories. Or after solicitation of several sources, competition is determined to be inadequate. And you would have to document this really, really well. Maybe have gone through, if you only get one bid, you'd probably have to kind of determine why you only got one bid. Maybe it wasn't appropriately advertised. You need to get the word out there, and you would likely have to resolicit that contract, kind of work at it maybe one or two more times before you could definitively say that there weren't enough contractors or vendors that were able to compete in whatever your solicitation is. For any kind of thought on non-competitive procurement, so independent cost estimates are definitely required for this because there's no other way to compare prices or costs across vendors. But if you're ever thinking about a sole source non-competitive procurement, if you think that that might have to happen or is the most appropriate way to move forward, pause and reach out to DCA. Don't take any actions towards performing a non-competitive procurement until you have spoken to DCA. Because these are so restricted, we don't want anyone to get into the situation where they've awarded a sole source contract and then it cannot be reimbursed with CDBG-DR funds. We don't want anyone to get into that situation. So if you're thinking about it, if you think maybe you fall into one of those categories that we just talked about, definitely reach out to DCA to talk through this. This would be kind of a special case-by-case scenario. And again, just our summary of this type of procurement and where you can find it in the CFR. These would have to be like very, very, very well documented as well. Okay, next knowledge check. So your organization needs to procure a contractor to repair and make resiliency updates to your local water treatment plant. One of the potential vendors is a longtime partner who has always provided excellent service. How should you handle the procurement to ensure full and open competition? A, you can reach out to this vendor for a cost estimate. If the cost is reasonable, award the vendor a contract to complete that work. Write a memo for your procurement file that justifies making a sole source award of the contract to this vendor. Or C, put the contract out to bid and allow participation by all qualified potential vendors. Review bids and award to the lowest responsible bidder.
I would go for B.
Seeing a lot of C's in the chat.
Yes, the answer here is C. So even, and this can kind of be tough sometimes. Even if you have a partner who has been a great contractor for a really long time, they're very trusted, you know that they do good work, per your federal procurement requirements, that is not a reason or a justification to just hand them work that could go out to a competitive process. So, in your competitive process, you also can't write it in a way where it is geared towards that vendor that would, that would have requirements or restrictions that would, that would limit it to, be very specific to that vendor. You would have to go out like you would with any other. And, obviously they stand a good chance because they'd probably write a great proposal for you, or, they have good experience that you would evaluate. This would likely be a lowest bid situation. So you would still want to go for, again, the lowest responsible bidder. You're not required to award to an unresponsible bidder who doesn't meet kind of some basic minimum threshold criteria. But here you would be required to put it out to bid and award to the lowest responsible bidder. So here, HUD every once in a while will come in and they really like looking at procurement files when they do. And, additionally, DCA might come in and review documentation as well to either their monitoring team or their program team. This is what we see a lot in these HUD programs where folks maybe have issues. The first, and this is, I want to make this really clear because we haven't talked about this in another slide, but the cost plus percentage of cost contracting structure is expressly prohibited under 2 CFR 200. So you cannot have a cost plus percentage of cost construction contract built into this. And that's because this contract structure may encourage folks to inflate their base price if they have a cost plus percentage of cost. So this is expressly prohibited using federal funds. Another common finding is that the subrecipient did not prepare an independent cost estimate prior to receiving proposals and have that well documented. The use of excessive change orders or contract modifications, along with the failure to conduct required cost and price analysis. So if you're doing a contract modification, especially for larger ones, that same cost and price analysis is required as if you were doing a new procurement. And if you're getting kind of farther and farther away from your original contract scope or proposal scope, that's going to be looked at really closely to make sure that folks aren't kind of issuing new work that wasn't contemplated under the original solicitation or procurement. They're looking for the inclusion of non-competitive practices or requirements, anything that might unfairly or unnecessarily restrict who's going to provide bids or proposals. Failure to have an adequate contract administration system to track the history of each procurement action. Again, record keeping is really important here. And then, adding new or additional scope to existing or expired contracts. So this is, through a change order or a contract modification, kind of saying if it maybe CDBG-DR funding or this project had never been contemplated, you couldn't just then add on top of that a change order for your entire CDBG-DR project. So another quick check, local procurement policy allows a municipality to procure specialized professional services such as design or any firms, something that requires specialized background without a competitive process. The municipality needs these specialized design services for the CDBG-DR grant. Can the grantee utilize, or the subrecipient utilize its local procurement policy to procure a firm without a competitive process? Yes or no? Did I stump folks with this one?
I have one no,
Let's try no.
couple more no's.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So again, you must use the most restrictive policy here. And in this case, that's the federal policy around sole source procurements, your local policy, while it might allow this under the federal procurement requirements, this is not one of the instances where you could issue a sole source procurement. So we wanted to just talk to you briefly because I know I think everyone on this call is kind of in the pre-award area. You haven't yet signed your grant agreements with, or your subrecipient agreements with DCA. And so while pre-award costs are not reimbursable with CDBG-DR funds, the subrecipients may still need to contract with a vendor now prior to award execution. Maybe this is for your design, your early design services. Maybe it's for environmental. So we understand that you might be going into procurements now prior to your grant execution. You should alert DCA to any procurement actions that are planned, particularly prior to environmental review completion, so that they can check your status, make sure, if you haven't completed environmental review yet, that there are no choice limiting actions that are happening due to this procurement, and kind of give you the sign off on moving forward. And then, even though it's pre-award now, if you plan on in the future reimbursing this contract, once you execute your award with CDBG-DR funds, you still need to, at this time, solicit and contract and procure these firms in compliance with CDBG-DR requirements. So even though you're pre-award right now, if you plan on doing any reimbursement with CDBG-DR funds in the future, it needs to be procured correctly. So I won't spend too much time on change orders and contract modifications, but again, I just want to flag, substantial changes to scope of work are generally going to require a new procurement. Particularly if you have an existing contract that was procured that didn't contemplate CDBG-DR funding, it's very difficult to just add this new project on top of it. Is likely going to require a new procurement. But let's say, there is a justified change order or modification. We know this happens particularly as you're going along through a project. Maybe site conditions are a little bit different than what you were anticipating. However the project proceeds. Obviously sometimes change orders and modifications are required. If they are above the simplified acquisition threshold, you need to do the same cost analysis as you would for a new procurement. You need to have that on file, and that change order or modification, those costs need to be reasonable and justified. Again, you should always be considering the impacts to your overall grant budget. And, they must be reasonable and necessary. And, you should recognize and be aware too that cost overruns, may be borne by the subrecipient. So I know I've said a bunch of times how important, having a full and complete procurement file is. So DCA is going to provide all of the subrecipients with a procurement checklist. The image here, I know you can't really read it. This is not the full procurement checklist. I just wanted to kind of show a screenshot for you to see what the structure looks like. And following this, you'll want to use this checklist both prior to your solicitations to make sure that you have all the requirements in there, that you're using the correct solicitation, that you followed all the steps to a correct procurement. And then you should use this following your contract execution to make sure that your procurement and contract file is complete. And this is just a really useful tool. If you have this done where you can say, yes, this required element is in my solicitation on this page, this required element is in my contract on this page. This is going to make it so much easier if HUD or if DCA or if anyone comes in and asks to see your procurement files. It's such a good way to organize things and make sure that you have a really good and complete procurement file that tells a story of how you issued this award. We'll get a little bit into the contracting requirements here. I wanted to focus mostly, and DCA wanted to focus mostly on procurement today, but in your contracts, because potentially you might want to put like a draft contract or something in your procurements. Sometimes that can be good practice so folks know what they're getting into, right? And so your contract should have your general administrative provisions, needs to have, effective date, who the parties to the contract are. It needs to have a period of performance, so your start and end date to the contract. Should have your detailed scope of services. It needs to have information on the method of compensation and how payments will be issued. Terms and conditions, which should be consistent. Once you get your grant agreements to anything that needs to flow down from your grant agreement to your contractors, potentially, and other requirements such as liquidated damages, and then special conditions or specific provisions that you may require as well. I wanted to flag for you here Appendix 2 to Part 200. So in the requirements at 2 CFR 200-327, it refers you to these required contract provisions. It's to say that if you're using federal funds, you need to include the required contract provisions that are under Appendix 2 to Part 200. So these are detailed in the CFR. We can provide a link to this. So the information here, A through L, these are the required contract provisions. It didn't include the full write-up on each of these, but it is important for each of you to read through what these requirements are, what these contract provisions are, and build these into your contracts. And if you're putting out a draft contract, it's really great to include these. And I would recommend, for everyone, these should be included in your procurements so that your potential contractors, vendors know what they're going to be required to comply with, particularly for ones that are going to impact their price, such as Davis-Bacon. They need to know that, but all of these require certain, compliance efforts or potentially reporting. And so they should be aware of these ahead of time. And Appendix 2 to Part 200 details what should be included on each of these. And some of these have different dollar thresholds as well. Some, are only triggered at $10,000 or $100,000. So for these contract provisions, please go to Appendix 2 to Part 200 and review these and make sure that these are incorporated into any and all of your CDBG-DR funded contracts as appropriate. Like I said, there may be some that are triggered or not depending on the contract value. Section 3 is a HUD requirement that focuses on participation of low income individuals in federally funded or in HUD funded contracts. So any contract that triggers Section 3 must include Section 3 language, and this should also absolutely be in your solicitation that contractors who are subject to Section 3 must comply with the requirements under Section 3, and these largely include reporting requirements on if their business is a Section 3 business concern, which generally means if they're majority owned by low-income individuals or majority of the employees are low-income individuals, or tracking the labor hours of low-income individuals. Section 3 workers is what they're called for this project. So I'd say most of your CDBG-DR contracts are going to trigger Section 3. And so in all of your solicitations and your contract, you should make sure that you have the appropriate and required Section 3 contract language so that your contractors understand what their obligations are under this program. So there are bonding requirements. This language here is taken directly from 2 CFR 200. So these are the bonding requirements that are required for any of your CDBG-DR funded projects. There's a bid guarantee from each bidder equivalent to 5% of the bid price, a performance bond on contracts of 100% of the contract price, and a payment bond at 100% of the contract price. So these are all required or are the bonding requirements as detailed in 2 CFR 200. So these should also be included in your solicitations. As subrecipients, you're also required to post any of your contracts that are funded with CDBG-DR funds. DCA will also post these. And so we really recommend that any CDBG-DR subrecipient have a page on their website that's dedicated to the CDBG-DR grant. On that page, normally you'll have kind of a description of the project, any relevant policies and procedures or things that you want to share publicly, where you would put a public notice, information like that. And then you should also be posting on this page, or that's a recommendation. You can kind of set it up however you need to, but posting your CDBG-DR funded contracts on this page. And right here is just an example of the DCA page where those are posted. I think this is our last knowledge check. So you have contracted with a firm to provide design services for your CDBG-DR project. The procurement was compliant with federal regulations. You recently learned that this firm actually provides additional services you know will be required for project implementation, but these services were not included in the original solicitation or contract scope. Can you leverage this existing contract for these additional services? Any guesses?
Seeing a no. No.
Great. So that's correct. As we talked about, if it wasn't contemplated in the original procurement, wasn't in that solicitation or scope, you couldn't just amend it, even though obviously that would be so nice, so convenient. You like this person, they're already on board, but this would likely require a new solicitation, a new procurement. So that's everything, right? That was procurement in a nutshell. We have now still a half an hour to do Q&A. We'll definitely would love to respond to questions now, particularly if you want, if we can go back to a slide or get some clarification on this. If you have kind of case specific questions, definitely feel free to ask them now. But if it is like something that's really specific to your particular grant or situation, it might be something that we just have to follow up with offline. But definitely feel free to, ask questions now. If you want to go back to a slide or get further clarification on anything, let us know. You could put it in the chat. Chris will, can help pull those up. Or at this time, you can definitely feel free to come off of mute and ask a question.
Is that Yassine? You can feel free to speak.
Hi, Dana.
Hi.
Thank you. So I had a question about just the way that the city procures for RFPs. So if the city wants to award a contract to a design firm, typically what they do is they issue an RFP, and that RFP asks for an associated cost proposal with a breakdown of where the hours would go, either principal engineer, design engineer, things like that. And I know I'm referring back to your slide, which was RFP versus RFQ. So that's the intention that we're gonna go with. Is that okay? For design services?
Yeah, that would absolutely. Okay, I'm not on mute, right? You can all hear me?
We
Yeah.
can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, that would be an appropriate way to solicit for design services. That would fall under that RFP category. And you can, like you said, you do want to evaluate price in addition to those other, qualifications, proposed method, and experience. So yeah,
So
for
did you
design.
also say that we would have to have a cost estimate prepared for the design services as well?
So if you anticipate this contract to be over $250,000, which is the simplified acquisition threshold, you are required to do an independent cost estimate ahead of time to get an idea of how much this might cost. That's for any solicitation, not just for construction contracts.
Okay, and
If it is,
sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Does that cost estimate get submitted to the DCA before we decide to award the contract, or before we even advertise, or how does that work?
That's a good question. I don't think that we had anticipated. I think this would be something that is typically just required as part, whenever you would have to submit your procurement package, for review by DCA. This would kind of be part of that. But I don't know, Jim or folks, we hadn't really talked about when the independent cost estimate would get submitted specifically. Um, and so this might be something we want to just take offline, but this is something that, if you're just in coordination with DCA prior to your procurement, you would want to make sure that you have this on file. I think that DCA would want to review to make sure that you did it, and that is documented well. It wouldn't necessarily be something where they're going to then bring in additional cost estimators or whatever to verify your work.
Okay. And I have one final question. So I operate in the capacity as a municipal engineering consultant, and I'm going to be writing the RFP. Does that mean that the firm that I work for in a municipal engineering capacity, knowing the fact that we'll be writing the RFP, does that pretty much prohibit us from bidding out on the design services contract?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so and again, because this is very specific, in typically, yes, if it is a firm that has been involved in designing the solicitation that is going out, that would kind of be a conflict and would provide that unfair advantage to the firm, and so they would be excluded from participation in that solicitation.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I have one quick question. I'm sorry if I'm interrupting anybody, but this is Inti, and I have a quick question. Between RFP and RFQ, does that mean that RFQ we should not ask for a price? Just like for RFP, we ask for the sealed price and a separate envelope, but based on the scope of work, and if you want to have the applicants, responders, provide us the cost for their services. I'm not talking about the construction bids, only for the consulting services. So is
Right.
it okay to ask for the price?
Yes, it is okay to ask for the price. If you're going, it kind of, this is a little bit of semantics, but if you are evaluating price or cost as a part of your method, you're issuing an RFP. And again, the RFQ is just something very where you can choose to use that method where you are not evaluating price only for architecture and engineering services. But if you are if you're requesting that price, that would kind of fall under the RFP requirements. Does that answer your question? It
Yeah,
is
because
okay to request price, yes.
Yeah, you answered my question, yes, but remaining thing is for RFP, we are kind of bounded by the lowest apparent lowest responder. But for the RFQ, we are not under that constraint. We are pretty much open to negotiate the price.
For an RFP, you are required to consider price in your evaluation methodology or criteria. You are not required to award to the lowest bidder, but you would need to show in your solicitation how you are going to weigh cost or price in your evaluation.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Right. A question from Joseph.
Yes, and this is following up on a previous comment, because I'm also the municipal engineer for one of the grant recipients, who would basically be conflicted out from doing any of the design consultant work for the project. Is it possible, should the grant recipient pay external from the grant awards, would that just still disqualify the design, like us as a design firm? So if the grant recipient was willing to fund the design things outside of the cost, or outside of reimbursable things, and basically waived reimbursement. Is that feasible?
If the subrecipient is not using CDBG-DR funds to reimburse that contract, then they would be required to follow their own local procurement code for that. And so it would be kind of what the local procurement code dictates in that instance.
Okay, understood.
Can I just hop off Joseph's question there? And I know Joseph was specific towards the engineering aspect or design for that, but I guess my question would probably be along those lines. But I guess in terms of any cost, is that how it would work? So for example, if my project is $1.5 million and I got a grant for $1 million, obviously I'm going to request reimbursement on expenses up to $1 million. But some of those expenses that I don't plan on, or that are part of the project, like for example, the design, or maybe the construction inspection, if I decide to not ask for reimbursement on that, because I already know, for example, the construction is going to be $1.2 million. So I'm only going to put in the construction costs. Does that mean that for the construction inspection, for example, I only need to follow my local public contracting laws versus these contracting laws, assuming that these contracting laws were more restrictive?
Sure. So I'm going to kind of partially answer this, and then DCA, if you have anything to add, let me know. Because I don't want to talk too much in hypotheticals, but correct. If there is no CDBG-DR funding being used to reimburse some contracts, and I'm going to say some because so if you're not going to use CDBG-DR to reimburse your contract, typically then it is fine to use your local code. What I want to flag is if you are contemplating anything that, because you look at the whole project as a CDBG-DR funded project, let's say you were going to issue 2 construction contracts for this to do 2 different things. Both of those are, even if maybe you're not funding one of them with CDBG-DR, because it's a CDBG-DR project, it's still going to trigger Davis-Bacon. It's still going to be subject to CDB or to Section 3. So sometimes, even if they're working on a CDBG-DR project, even if the contract isn't CDBG-DR funded, it's going to trigger some requirements. So that's why, like for this instance, I think it's a really good idea to maybe reach out with a specific scenario. But if I do think if you're able to like set aside fully a contract and for a specific discrete service, and that is going to be fully funded by your municipal funds, it was never, you don't have enough CDBG-DR funds for this. I do think that is a scenario where potentially you could just use your local code, but I would encourage you to come and like ask the specific question so that we have a really good sense of how that's going to shake out and can maybe flag any of those potential issues if CDBG-DR requirements are still going to be triggered.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the scenario that we've come across the most is with the design firms. The one example that we've given to a couple of the subrecipients we've talked to, and I'll go through a hypothetical. It's a $7 million total project cost. And, we know that the cap for our award is $5 million. And let's say we know that none of the design funding is going to come from us. You can then follow your own procurement policies, making sure there's no conflict of interest or anything like that in that scenario. But anything you do, I think going through these on the call here with a few different scenarios, it just calls out that there's so many different options and scenarios that let us know, talk to us, let us take a look at it first, and we'll kind of make the determination from there. Any other questions?
Yeah, anything coming through the chat or?
No?
I think that means you did a great job, Dana.
I know I talked for a while. Obviously, everyone here knows that Jim and his team, you guys have been talking to them a lot. They're there to support you if obviously this is a lot of information to process. This is just one piece of your understanding of the procurement requirements. So please do make sure you're reviewing the chapter from the subrecipient manual. Please do, we'll share this presentation and all. Make sure you're clicking on these links to read the requirements so that you can get an understanding of them as well. The second one is a HUD guidance document that they put out. It's called Buying Right, and it's how to procure with CDBG-DR funds. It's pretty detailed, but it's a good also reference document if you ever wanted more information on that. And then again, if you have kind of follow-up questions on how to conduct a cost or a price analysis, HUD has some useful tools here as well. So we provided a link to that. But I'm sure things will come up. So yeah, key takeaway for sure is to always be talking to your DCA counterparts on this, and they'll make sure that your procurement is done right and in line, and then you don't have to worry about whether or not it'll be reimbursable later on with the HUD funds or at risk for any reason.
Yeah, so thank you, Dana. Really, we appreciate it. And yeah, everyone just stay in touch. Let us know your progress. Let us know if you're, before you do anything, if you want us to review it. We obviously want to review it before you take any steps. And if you haven't scheduled your monthly calls yet, please contact our email address so we can get those calls scheduled. But most of you have, so we appreciate that. But there were a few that we're still just trying to lock in. So with that, we're always here. Feel free to email us or we'll set up a call if you need something. But we do plan to do additional calls like this, and any feedback is welcome too. If you feel there's a way to improve this type of training, feel free to let us know. We're all ears. So thank you everyone for your time.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks all.
Thank you.